In the evening your time. So I appreciate you staying up late for this talk. I hope that you find it interesting. So today I'll be talking about some new developments in the area of text linguistics. And I'll challenge some traditional approaches to how we analyze texts, specifically with regard to register. Brief outline. I'll talk about register and the principles of register analysis and the traditional methods that we've relied on, and then talk about text linguistics more generally. What do we know about language through the lens of studying individual texts and collections of texts and corpora? And then I'll give a couple of case studies that show how some new findings take us in a new and exciting direction with how we can analyze texts and corpora and what role registers have to play. And then we'll talk about some conclusions and look to the future. So first, I'll talk about the text linguistic approach to register variation. I'll abbreviate this as TXTLXRV, but we're talking about text linguistics. So the analysis of text as the unit of observation, usually in corpora, and then this has a specific focus on register. So here are some things that we know through this approach. We know that linguistic features co-occur with each other. If you analyze a corpus of texts, you find that across those texts, we don't have random features happening together, rather they co-occur or they co-vary in clusters. For example, we might have nouns co-occurring with attributive adjectives and prepositional phrases. And we might have verbs co-occurring with different types of dependent clauses and with adverbs and things. And what we learned from this is that these co-occurrence patterns aren't random. They have functional reasons for co-varying, and going back to the early multidimensional analyses from Doug Biber and others, we've seen strong evidence for these patterns. So before we go any further, let's pause for a minute and make sure we all are on the same page about what is a text and what is a register. So a text is the fundamental unit of discourse. So when we're analyzing language at the discourse level, texts are how we keep language organized. We have a beginning of a text and an end of a text. In writing, this is very easy to see. We can look at the beginning of a book and the end of a book. We have a front and back cover. The boundaries of the text are clear. Newspaper articles, it's easy to see where it starts and where it ends. It's less clear what the boundaries are when we're speaking. And yet, we still have psycholinguistic boundaries, and the evidence is that we can talk about the text that we produce and receive on a daily basis. We can say, I heard an interesting lecture. I had a talk with him. We had a nice conversation. That was when we were meeting in office hours, right? So even in conversation and even in interactive speech, we can still organize language into these units. It's just a little bit harder to see them because they don't have physical boundaries that we can observe. And these texts occur naturally. They're self-contained within these boundaries, and they also serve functions in language. There's a reason we produce texts. We don't just go out and produce language haphazardly. We have a reason for producing the texts that we do and for engaging in language in textual units. So what is a register?
Sorry, Jesse. Are you sharing anything? PowerPoint, maybe? It's not showing.
Oh, it says it's sharing on my end. You want me to share it again?
Yes, please.
Sorry, let's see here.
Sorry,
it has me.
Yeah.
Let me try it again. How's that?
All good.
Okay. Perfect. So Glad we got that cleared up. So a register has been traditionally defined as a variety of language associated with a particular situation of use. So let's look at a quick example. We're going to use trees as a metaphor for how language works. So if language is like a forest of many trees, then texts are like the individual trees. Each one has life in itself. Each one is independent. Each one has its own function and its own clear self-contained boundaries. And yet we often see them clustering together, and we see similar texts happening in registers, and we see similar trees happening in groves or in forests. And so individual species of tree are like registers. We can have pine trees and maple trees and oak trees, and you can think of any variety of trees where they all share certain traits in common. And yet each individual tree is a separate organism. In the same way, registers are varieties of texts that share certain traits in common. However, each text is still its own separate, distinct individual unit. And then we can look at linguistic characteristics. So just like an ecologist or a forestry expert might look at the parts of trees, look at the fruit, look at the leaves, look at the branches, we can look at the pieces of texts. We can look at linguistic characteristics like counting the number of nouns or trying to see what the most frequent words are. And yet those nouns and those words, they don't get produced spontaneously. They aren't free floating. They are bound to that text. And without the text, they don't have any meaning. In the same way, if you pluck off a branch or a leaf from a tree, it dies because the life is in the tree. Well, here, I believe that texts as the fundamental unit of discourse are where life is. And the linguistic features help that and serve a role, but they're subservient to the text. And then we can talk about varieties of text like registers, but the registers themselves don't have their own life of their own. They are made up of text. So texts are really the heart and soul of language production at the discourse level. And registers are how humans organize texts in categories that we can understand and recognize and produce. So a second finding from this text linguistic approach to register variation is that there's a functional relationship between situation and language. So if we look at this, we have the context that the text was produced within on the left side, and we have linguistic characteristics on the right side, and those are linked together through communicative function. If the situation changes, we will typically change how we use language to better suit the functions that we're trying to accomplish in that situation. And this is an important finding that has emerged out of the register framework. Number three, the text linguistic approach to register variation proposes that registers are situationally homogeneous, that the texts within a register all share the same situational characteristics. In a moment, I'm going to challenge that and raise questions about whether that's true, but that's been the assumption. And the proof that we assume this is that when people describe the situational characteristics of a register, they do it at the register level. They say, you know, the register had these participants, it's this interactive, here's the communicative purpose, here's the channel and the mode. And they don't say, here's what it is for each text individually. They say this is true for the whole register, implying that it's true for every text within the register. And we'll see if that's the case in a minute. So we look at discrete register categories, one register group at a time. And the traditional approach is that we generalize this analysis to the entire register. The interesting thing is this is not how we've done things with language features. With linguistic features, we have always counted them at the level of the text, and each text gets its own count for linguistic features in the register approach. So for some reason, we've chosen to treat texts as the level of analysis for linguistic features, but for situational features, we treat the register as the level of analysis, and we haven't been looking at individual texts to see what their individual characteristics are. And as we'll see in a moment, I'm going to propose that we've been missing some important variability because texts, in fact, do vary from each other situationally, even within register boundaries. So if the orange and the green boxes are registers, and the y-axis, the vertical axis, is linguistic variation, we've kept texts in register categories, and we have said, well, the text, these individual orange boxes and these individual green boxes, they can vary from each other linguistically on that y-axis, but they are still in these register categories and they're situationally homogeneous. This has been the assumption. And we can look at the averages, the dark, the filled in orange box and the filled in green box might be the average for the register. And we could say, oh, look, the green register uses more of this feature and the texts are more spread out. And the orange register uses fewer of those features and the texts are closer together. But we treat those categories as discrete and we don't analyze situational variability within them. So what we are saying in addition, this fourth finding or this fourth assumption is that every register is made up of texts and that every text has a register. Again, another thing I'll challenge in a minute. I'll ask whether it's true that every text belongs to a register. Is it possible that text could exist outside of register boundaries? So here's our snapshot of our framework with texts and registers if we use the example of trees and forests. And these two things I'll question in this talk. Are registers situationally homogeneous? Is every text the same situationally? And does every text have a register? So I'll tell you a story about a research project that I worked on with Doug Biber, where some of these assumptions that we both believed started to come into question. We had this disruption in our belief about these things. We were doing an NSF grant, a National Science Foundation grant, and the goal was to describe the situational and linguistic characteristics of web registers, of the registers on the internet. We had a problem. Most of the texts on the web have no label for register. There's no way to know what register the text belonged to. If it's a newspaper article, that's nice. It's published in a newspaper and we know it's news. But there were many things on the web that we didn't have a name for. We had no idea what these things were. So this was a rare instance where instead of collecting a corpus by saying we want these 5 registers, let's collect texts from each of the 5 registers and create a corpus, we didn't have that option. We didn't know what the registers were. We had no set of all the registers and we didn't have labels for what texts belonged to which. So instead, we needed to just go out and scoop up a large sample of the internet and categorize the registers after. So this became the largest ever manual register classification project. We had about 50,000 texts or about 50 million words of language, and every single text was manually coded by 4 separate people for register category. And this took a long time and it took a lot of people. There were about 1,000 people who helped to classify these 50,000 texts for us using a framework that we developed. And what we realized was this earlier approach of just saying, well, every text belongs to a register and we knew what the register wasn't working anymore. We started to realize that the world of texts might be messier than we had assumed. So we had these 50,000 texts were all classified for their register categories by 4 different people. And what we expected was we will see familiar registers. Some of the categories that we see from these raters will be registers we've seen before, like newspaper articles. We also expected some new registers. We thought we'll probably see some registers we've never seen before, but the people who coded them will clearly know what they are once they look at the text. And then we expected that each text, every one of the 50,000 texts would fall neatly into a register category. We would be able to assign a text to a category in every case with no leftover texts. Here's what we actually found instead. We found hybrid texts that had situational characteristics of more than one register. One text that merged together the features of 2 registers or more. And then we also found texts that did not belong to any register category at all. So we had 4 raters for each text. And in some cases, each of the 4 raters said the text belonged to a separate register. They gave us 4 different answers. And we realized when we looked at the text, we said, well, maybe we can resolve it. We're experts on registers, right? So we can go in and just look at the text and we'll resolve it. And we looked and said, oh, we don't know what this is either. We have no idea. And so we started to wonder whether our view of register and text was overly simplistic. Was it too simple? So we published a paper where we talk about register in a continuous situational space, allowing texts to vary from each other situationally. So we took about 1,000 of the texts from this web corpus, and we did a new coding project. But now, instead of telling the coders, you need to assign each text to a register category, we told them, here are a bunch of situational parameters, situational characteristics, and we want you to code each of the texts for each of those 23 parameters. And we didn't tell them in advance what register these texts belong to, if they belong to a register at all. We gave them the text, we gave them the 23 situational characteristics, and we said, code these on a 6-point scale. So here are the 23 characteristics. We asked them to code the text for whether it was spoken and to what degree. Was it lyrical, pre-planned, interactive? So if it was highly interactive, they would give it a 5 or a 6. If it was not interactive at all, they would give it a 0 or a 1. What did they know about the author or the speaker? What was the purpose of the text? And each of these was coded not in yes or no, but in matters of degrees. To what extent does the text narrate past events, 1 through 6, and so on? And then we did a multidimensional analysis, but this was the first situational multidimensional analysis. So instead of saying, let's take linguistic features and see how they co-occur and then look at the linguistic dimensions, we took these situational parameters, these 23 variables, and we looked at how they co-occurred, and we tried to find situational dimensions of variation across the 1,000 texts in our sample. And then we did a cluster analysis to try to find text types, to try to say which texts are more similar or less similar, not using the register categories, but using the situational features from the bottom up to try to cluster the text together. So we continued to work on this problem, and we continued to do research trying to better understand what can we learn about variation between texts within registers, and what can we learn about texts that don't seem to belong to any register at all. And this led us to publish a recent paper where we propose a new definition for register. We show that text within a single register can vary linguistically and situationally, that registers can vary in the degree of how situationally homogeneous or similar the texts are, and that some texts don't belong to any category at all. And we said, well, the way forward for register research is to say registers aren't scientifically defined, they're culturally defined. So cultures decide collectively what registers are meaningful and what they'll call them. And this allows people within that culture, that discourse community, to produce texts and categories that make sense to them. This also allows us to measure situation at the text level and continuously, just like we always have for linguistic features. Remember, linguistic variables have always been measured at the text level and continuously, and now we're doing it with situational characteristics as well. There's no reason we couldn't have started out this way. We just made some assumptions about register that didn't turn out to be true. And then we showed that the text linguistic approach to register variation was limited to only texts that fall within registers, and that we needed to add to that. So we propose a new way of asking questions about text linguistic variation. And I'm calling this the text linguistic approach to functional correspondence. So remember, text linguistics is all about understanding linguistic variation across texts. And we had the TXT-LLX-RV approach, the text linguistic approach to register variation that focuses on register. Well, now we have a new research question. We don't have to get rid of that. Registers are real. They're culturally recognized categories. Analyzing them is meaningful. But there's this new research question that has to do with analyzing all linguistic variation across texts, regardless of whether they belong to a register category or not. So the register variation approach has the goal of describing and comparing the characteristics of registers, the situational characteristics and the linguistic characteristics of registers. They use text to understand register categories. In contrast, the text linguistic approach to functional correspondence has the goal of accounting for variation among texts in terms of situational variables. This could include register. Register could be one of those variables, but there are additional variables that we can code at the level of the text in order to understand how texts vary from each other in the real world. Not when we go out and say, I want some text from this register and I want some text from that register. But when we look at the full universe of all texts out there, including the texts that don't belong to a register, including the texts that belong to a register but look a bit different than the others, this text linguistic approach to functional correspondence includes all of those. And then I understand, why do they differ from each other? How can we explain that functionally? So the text linguistic approach to functional correspondence uses register to understand texts and also other variables to understand texts. Now the question is not what can we learn about registers? The question is, what can we learn about texts? And maybe registers can help, but we also have a lot of other variables like the 23 that we coded for, which may help too. So we have this goal of accounting for variation among texts, and it's a new goal. We've sort of been doing this, but we've only been limiting it to register, and now we're opening up the doors for understanding text variation, no matter what the source, whether it's register or something else. So the methods for this approach: first, the observational unit is a text. We do manual situational analysis of each text. We look at the relevant situational parameters. And then if you choose to, you can also look at the register of the text as an additional variable. And then we analyze the linguistic features of each individual text. And we can use correlation or regression and find relationships between the situational characteristics on the one hand and the linguistic characteristics on the other. And ultimately, the goal is to find how do patterns of language use relate to the situational variables that each text was produced in or is related to. So we try to find a functional link between the situational characteristics of the text and the linguistic features that were produced within the text. So let's revisit this model that we looked at a while ago. Remember, the text linguistic approach to register variation says, well, we have register categories, and texts don't vary situationally within them. They do vary linguistically within those. Well, now let's change the picture so that it represents the text linguistic approach to functional correspondence. Now notice the x-axis, the horizontal axis on the bottom, is no longer register variation or register category, it's situational variation. And this allows us to see that texts can vary from each other situationally in addition to linguistically. We don't force texts to be the same situationally. We allow them to differ from each other within a register in terms of their situational characteristics and their linguistic characteristics. And notice these two registers are still pretty easy to identify. We've got, we can draw circles around the body of text and say, oh, look, there's a relationship as texts, contain more of these situational characteristics. They tend to move up in a certain linguistic feature. Imagine, maybe the x-axis is how narrative is the text. And as a text becomes more narrative along the x-axis, it also includes more past tense verbs on the y-axis. So no matter the register, if the text within that register become more narrative, you're narrating events, well, we tend to use more past tense verbs. And we also tend to use more third person pronouns and so on. So that's part of the picture. We can look at how registers have variation within them situationally and linguistically, but we also have to account for all of these blue squares, these blue texts, which don't have any register at all. And some of them might fall within the circles of the other registers, and some of them might fall outside. But the key is, if they don't belong to the register category in the culture, if the culture doesn't see them as belonging to the register category, then they don't belong, no matter how they look. Because we've redefined register as a culturally recognized construct. So let's look at a couple of case studies of how we've applied this model and what we can learn when we try to account for the functional relationship between situation and language across texts. So case study 1, we took 850 texts randomly sampled from the web, and we automatically tagged them for linguistic features. And then we ran a linguistic multidimensional analysis, and the first dimension was the positive end was oral involved. So text with a high score had a lot of linguistic features related to speech and oral discourse. And text with low scores had a lot of linguistic features associated with informational language. So on the positive end, we might see interview transcripts from the web. And on the low end, we might see encyclopedia articles like those from Wikipedia. we manually coded each of these texts, each of these 849 texts for register category by 4 separate coders, and also for the 23 situational parameters. So this is the same data I showed you before, where we have register, and we also have each of the individual texts coded for these continuous parameters. And remember, this is what those look like. And then we have this situational multidimensional analysis. So we have these 2 situational dimensions. One is personal opinionated discourse versus technical information supported with evidence. And the next is narrative entertaining discourse versus explanatory procedural discourse. And our research questions was, how much of the linguistic variability that we see in this linguistic dimension 1 can we predict or explain or account for using register category, using the continuous situational dimensions, and then using a combination of both? Here's what the register categories look like. I know this is kind of small, but we're focusing on texts that belong to a register versus those that don't. So you can see news reports, opinion blogs, and encyclopedia articles belong to a register. But notice at the very bottom, there are 216 texts in the data set that don't have any register at all. For the register analysis, those were excluded. So here are the results of the register analysis. We have 633 texts that belong to a register. We had to discard 216 that don't. And you can see we find variability. Encyclopedia articles are down on the low end. Way on the right-hand side, we have things like personal blogs and, fiction and so on. And this gives us an R-squared value of 0.41. So R-squared is the variance accounted for by this variable. So we get about 41% of the variance in dimension 1 scores across texts accounted for by register category by itself, all alone. So now let's see what things look like if we use the situational variables, the 23 situational variables, and instead of using register category, let's just use those 23 and see how much variance we can predict that way. So here's the relationship between linguistic dimension 1, still on the y-axis, and situational dimension 1 on the x-axis. And you can see there's a pretty tight relationship. This is the same 633 texts, but instead of register, we're looking at the situational dimensions that we derived from the 23 situational variables. And you can see a pretty strong relationship there. Here's situational dimension 2. This is the second dimension. The relationship goes in the opposite direction, but you can still see that texts seem to pattern together. And if we combine these two together, then we get about 39% of the variance in texts, how they vary in linguistic dimension 1 scores, accounted for by these 2 situational variables. And we didn't use register at all. Register wasn't even part of the equation. Now let's take a look at what happens when we combine forces. What happens when we combine register and situational variables together? Well, we get a total of 50% of the variance accounted for. So half of all the variance in linguistic dimension 1 scores can be accounted for by the combination of register category, the 2 situational dimensions, and when we add them together, you can see in the green on the right-hand side in that plot, 30% of the variance out of the 50, 30% is shared, meaning it overlaps. The register category and the situational dimensions are telling us something similar. And this makes sense because registers are related to situations. But look at the unique variance. You can see that we get 9% additional variance accounted for by the situational variables that has nothing to do with register. And we get 11% of the variance accounted for by register that has nothing to do with the situational variables we coded for. And I mean, there's a lot that we need to learn to better explain this and understand it. One thing is, well, what is the remaining 50%? Where is that variance and how do we explain it in the future? Are we missing some situational variables? How do we explain that 50% that we haven't managed to capture? And then we can start to understand, why is there some variation from situation that isn't related to register? And why is register telling us part of the story that isn't related to situation? And I think there's a lot of mysteries there that we still need to look into. And then remember, we left out 216 texts. So we left those out because register couldn't account for them. They had no register at all. So what do? Well, we can analyze these with the situational approach. With the functional correspondence approach, we can see that 39% of the variability is accounted for by these two dimensions. And this is our only option because these texts had no register. We cannot do a register analysis. Okay, so here's a quick plot that shows you, look at what happens within each individual register. So encyclopedia articles, you can see are a smaller cluster down in the bottom left-hand corner, but they still have a relationship between the situational and the linguistic features. And then each of the registers has more or less variability, and you can see this positive correlation still exists between situation and language. It just looks different for each register. And this is kind of testing out the model that we proposed. So we saw these different goals side by side. Register variation helps us to learn about register, but if we want to learn about the full universe of texts, we need to take this functional correspondence approach. Both of them are okay. Neither of them is better than the other. But for the last 30 or 40 years, we've only been doing the first one. And then it wasn't until just the last few years that we started doing the second one. And I think this is an exciting new avenue for research that we have a lot more work to do in. And these two can work side by side. One doesn't replace the other. They're both important. They just have different goals. So we know functional correspondence exists between registers, among texts within registers, and across texts outside of registers. We know register and situational context are related to each other, but they're not completely the same. They seem to be independent in some ways. We can use the register variation approach when we care about categories or when texts aren't coded for situational variables. Maybe you have a corpus and it's not coded manually for situational variables. Well, it might be coded for register and you can use this approach. But we can use this text linguistic approach to functional correspondence when the research questions focus on situational context at the text level, and when we're trying to account for all variability across texts, regardless of the source. That might be register, but it could be combined with other things as well. And then the text linguistic approach to functional correspondence is our only option when texts don't belong to a register. Now, most corpora we have make it appear that every text has a register. Why? Because the creators of that corpus decided in advance which registers they wanted in their corpus, and they went out hunting for texts that fit within those registers. They ignored texts that have no register at all. if you go out and you scoop up, if you scoop up many texts, ignoring the register category, just get every text that is ever produced in that domain, I expect that you'll find some texts don't belong to any recognizable register you're aware of. It's just we haven't tried it very often. And when you do try it, you'll find that the world isn't quite as clean as we thought it was 20 years ago. Okay, I want to show you some examples of how the text linguistic approach to functional correspondence can be applied to keywords and to key features. I want to wrap things up, so I'll go through this pretty briefly. I'm happy to share the slides if you would like to look at this more carefully. I just want to be able to show you how you can do keyword analysis or key linguistic feature analysis through correlation by looking at the relationship between the frequency of words and the situational text codes or scores on each text, and then the same thing for linguistic features. So we're going to look at corresponding word analysis and corresponding feature analysis. There's nothing been published on this yet. This is just me making up new stuff, but I hope to show you that it's interesting. So if we look at the British National Corpus Spoken 2014, we took a large portion of that corpus, Doug Biber and I and some others, and Tony McHenry at Lancaster University. We worked on manually segmenting these spoken files into discourse units or texts. And then we annotated each of those discourse units for 9 communicative purposes on a scale of 0 to 4. To what extent is this discourse unit giving advice, engaging in conflict, figuring things out, joking around, and so on? Each discourse unit could have multiple purposes with higher or lower scores, or maybe the purpose didn't occur at all. That was up to the coder. And then what we did was we took those scores for each discourse unit, and that was one of our variables. That's like our situational variable. And then we measured every word in the corpus and how frequent that word was. And then we converted that to just 0 or 1. Did the word occur in the text or not? And this is because word frequencies are very unstable, especially when texts are short. And by reducing this down to 0 or 1, it stabilizes it somewhat. A dichotomous variable, the word occurs or it doesn't, is more stable than trying to estimate the frequency of a word based on a very short text. And then we correlated. We used a point by serial correlation, and we then had a correlation for every word. How strong did that word correlate with each of the 9 communicative purposes? And then we can see for each of the 9 communicative purposes, which words were key or corresponded most strongly with that purpose. And here's what we got. I'll just have you take a look at these. For sharing feelings, the strongest correlations were really like, good, nice, feel, think, love. Describing the future, gonna, tomorrow, will, going. Describing the past, was, had, went. Figuring things out, what, what's, maybe, might, could, don't know. Giving advice, need, can, I'll, should, your, you, and so on. And you can see that each of these has a very different flavor. And the correlations help us to see which words relate most strongly to these situational parameters. And notice here, we're not doing a traditional keyword analysis by comparing categories to each other, target corpus, reference corpus. Instead, we're looking at the continuous relationship between the degree to which a text is sharing feelings and the degree to which it uses particular words. Okay, now let's look at corresponding feature analysis. Can we do the same thing with grammatical features? So we got rates of occurrence for individual grammatical features from the Biber tagger, and now we're going to correlate them with the communicative purposes that these discourse units were coded for. And here's some examples. So sharing feelings correlated with emphatics, factive adverbials, mental verbs, predicting the future, modals of prediction, be verbs, time adverbs, contractions, describing the past tense verbs, third person pronouns, communication verbs. Situation dependent commentary had present tense verbs, discourse particles, and contractions. And then the advice purpose had second person pronouns, possibility modals, and so on. So you can see that we're now doing continuous text linguistics. We're now measuring the relationship between situational, or in this case, purpose variables coded at the level of the text and individual linguistic features. And we don't need register categories because that's not our question here. Our question here is about relationships. So we can measure this correspondence between situational context and language use at the text level and continuously. And then we can interpret those functionally. And I think you saw the words and the features, they make sense that we can interpret the function of what they're doing there. But some of them might come as a surprise and we have to work a bit to understand them. So here's this model here. And we've seen a lot of evidence that this is happening, but also some ideas for how we might look at it in the future. I'll skip that slide. Let's talk a little bit about what the future holds. So here's my advice. If you're interested in register variation and your main goal is register research, then carry on. Continue to answer those interesting questions about how registers differ from each other, but just be aware that texts within a register can vary considerably from each other. The registers that a linguist recognizes might not be the same as what the culture or the real people recognize. And also be aware that your study is probably ignoring texts that didn't belong to any register at all. So we need to answer questions about what is a culturally recognized register? How do we account for that? What do we do about variation within registers? And then how do we explain the role of registers if they only happen for some texts and some texts don't belong to any register at all? For text linguistic approach to functional correspondence, well, we have a lot of work to do. If you're interested in this goal, if this makes sense to you as an interesting goal, well, we don't know nearly as much about this as we know about register. And so we have to develop new statistical methods. We need to explain texts that don't belong to any register at all. Is this functional and communicative only, or is there also a psycholinguistic component to this? How do we collect texts that don't belong to any register? What does this mean for corpus design? How much work is that going to be? What are all the situational parameters out there that exist, and how can we account for all of them? And then we need a systematic framework for functional analysis. So as we go about trying to functionally interpret things, we should be doing that using a framework that's systematic, and we're working on this right now. Okay, well, thank you for your time. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take some questions. I think we have a few minutes still.
Thank you very much, Jesse. That was really, really mind-blowing, and how register analysis has evolved. I studied Bible, and then this whole new framework of yours came in. But I do have a question though. You made me curious about the text not belonging to categories or in a register. And you, in what form were they? How do they look like? What do they talk about?
Yeah, so a great question. So on the web, this often looks like texts that have the characteristics of other registers that we're familiar with, but they're all merged together. So in some cases, we have categories of blogs that don't have narrative purpose or an opinion purpose or an informational purpose alone, but has a mix of all of them. So it's a blog post, but they begin by telling a story, and then it's clear that they're actually trying to share an opinion on something, and that story was aimed to support the opinion. And then along the way, they give you a lot of information. Well, what do we call that? Is it an informational blog, an opinion blog, a personal blog? It doesn't fit cleanly into a category. Another example, there was a type of text that emerged that we started calling description with intent to sell. So there's a lot of websites out there. They look like they're informational websites. You look at them and you say, oh, I see. This is simply information about this travel destination. But then you start to see down below, there's some links. And these links go to a website trying to get you to book travel through them. And you realize, well, wait, they didn't actually just want to give me information. They're trying to very subtly convince me to travel to this location and to book through their website. And what do you call that? It's a little bit like an infomercial, like a commercial where they give you lots of information, but ultimately they want you to buy the product. But when these are written down, we didn't have a name for them. You could call them persuasive, but that's a situational characteristic. What is their category? I don't think they have a name yet. So things like that. And then we could also think about things that happen in speech all the time. We use the term conversation to mean almost anything. And I don't think conversation is really a meaningful register category. It's really, conversation could be anytime two people or more speak to each other. But like, imagine you are walking down the hall on your way to a meeting and you run into a colleague and you weren't expecting to, and you greet each other, and then you're reminded you needed to ask the colleague about something. So you quickly say, oh, I was meaning to ask you, I only have a moment. And you discuss that really briefly. And then you say, by the way, I know I have to go, but how's the family? And then you take off. Well, what have you done? You could call that a conversation, but I don't know that it really has a clear register category. The point is, I don't believe you needed a category in your mind in order to be able to do what you needed to with language. You didn't have to pause and say, oh no, I can't use language until I know what category we're using. What is the register? Until we decide we can't use language. I think you looked at the situation, you looked at your colleague, your mind quickly oriented itself to what was happening, and you used language in a functional way. And if someone asked you later, what would you call what happened with your colleague? You'd probably say, oh, I don't know, we had a chat. I guess it was a conversation, but it kind of had a meeting feel because we also had to talk about that issue I brought up. But it didn't really matter to you. What mattered was you were capable of using language functionally based on the situation.
Yeah, that's like interdiscursivity, hybrids.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. Any questions? Let's see some questions. Someone's asked, what is the software to generate this? What do you mean by this here? To the person who asked, which part is the software that you wanted to know? Anyone? Sorry, the person who asked about the software, you were looking at the graphs, or were you, yeah, I suppose when you generated the findings for both TX frameworks, what was the software that you used? Jesse.
To generate, I'm still not clear which plot.
You used both frameworks and to generate the finding, the text LXF, FC, and the other one also. What was I'm sure they were wondering what was the software from a corpus linguistics area, they would want to know what is it a corpus tool or is it
Oh, I
something
see.
else? Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're talking about these correlations, these can be done in Excel. I used R, but there's simple correlations between two columns of data, and you could just use a function in Excel or R or anything. If you're talking about to get the situational dimensions, like these dimension scores here, that was also done in R. But you know, the coding was done in Excel, and then you take that spreadsheet and import it into any statistical software package, and we did factor analysis. But the correlations that I show later on, those are just simple correlations.
All right, all right. Okay, so another question would be, okay, someone asked for the slides. I suppose Jesse can email me and I'll share it with the network. Or if
Yeah, I'm happy to share slides.
yeah, if there's that's an attachment. Zoom allows attachment files over in chat box. So probably you can either there or through me. Okay.
Yeah, I'll try to attach them right now.
Great, great. Any more questions? Lu Gao has said something here. When we do genre analysis, the real challenge is hard to decide how many parameters should be included. Maybe Prof. Biber said 23, Prof. Lu said 46, and the other said 100, 200. We go to the old circle. I am interested in how I can use this method in corpus-assisted CDA analysis. Lu Gao, are you saying that you would apply Jesse's framework onto CDA analysis? Is it
Yeah,
possible,
and I'm
Jesse?
curious. You say Biber says 23 parameters. Professor Lu says 46. Are you talking about situational parameters?
Lu Gao, you can unmute yourself.
If you're talking about situational parameters, there's no agreed upon set. So there's no set of situational parameters that everyone agrees on. When Doug Biber and Susan Conrad wrote their book, Register, Genre, and Style, they give some examples of situational characteristics that can be considered, but they say this is not all of them. And you can see studies that have said, well, I'll use some of those, but I also have some other situational parameters that are relevant to the corpus I'm interested in. And so they add some. It can be adapted. It would be wonderful if we could discover the full universe of all situational parameters that could potentially have an impact on language use. But I think we're a long way from there. I don't think there's a list out there that we all agree on. So this is really useful for future research to try to take these different frameworks, these different sets of parameters, compare them, see how they overlap, see what's different, and actually do some research to figure out how much do they matter, and then maybe what are we missing still.
All right, great. Just see. So another question, sorry. Can I use Power BI or SPSS to generate the graph?
I'm still not clear which graph you mean.
Yeah, which graph is that, my dear?
If it's the scatter plots, that can be done in Excel or R or SPSS. I think any software package could generate scatter plots. And I think those were the main ones I used.
Oh, she said on slide 21. Did you number the slide? Slide 21.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So slide 21 is the box plot.
Box
And that
plot.
was done in R using ggplot.
I see, in R. All right.
And yeah,
R.
I'll type it in here. It's just
Mhm.
the geom box function in ggplot.
Oh, okay, all right. Right. Are there any more questions? If not, I do have a question. When you collected your data, um, did you use a web scraper, Python, or things like that? And how can, yeah, another question would be that the last future suggestion that you said, how do we not miss out the uh, the vague text, the ones without register? How do we avoid not missing out in collecting them?
Yeah, it's really hard. I think one of the main reasons that we haven't seen these in the past is because we haven't been looking for them. And I'm not saying this is the majority. I think register categories are useful for us as humans. And I think my best guess is that most texts do have a category that we would recognize them as belonging to. But when we collected text from the web, we used Google. We're only claiming that we have the searchable web, not everything, but we use Google. And then we provided Google searches with random n-grams, 3 grams, like and is the. And many of those 3 grams, no content words. We weren't looking for topics, but like and is the could happen in any text. But for the. And those were the search queries. And we did a lot of those. And we would take a bunch of the web pages that came back for those searches. And it turns out Google doesn't know what to do. When you don't give it topic words, you just give it function words. It doesn't know what to do. And the deeper you go in those search hits, the more it looks like it's just sort of giving you whatever. So we're not calling it a random sample because Google still had control. And we don't know how Google does things, but we went deep enough down that it did seem Google was confused and just gave us web pages. And so we got a lot of those. And in the process, we got, about a third, about 1/3 of our data didn't fall cleanly into a register category.
Well, that goes to show how society influences the discourse and that we are evolving. It's scary, but new texts are formed and people are getting creative. It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yep. The usual, text categories that we know of are no more. Perhaps you can invent those new terms. It's not narrative, it's not informative, it's something else. Something else, yeah. So, any more questions? Because it's 11:06. Abdullah Omar, he asked, do we use this method to compare languages?
I think that would be really interesting. You absolutely could. There's been some contrastive analysis of, different languages and the registers they have and what those registers look like, but no research that I'm aware of that looks at how texts are formed in different languages using this approach. And I think it would be really fascinating. I think it's a good avenue for future research. This is all very new. I mean, this stuff has come within the last 10 years. And so there's so much more to do.
Right. And when you said the first framework took 30 years, this new framework will be more years to deal with. Because it started in 2014 and then up till now, it's a lot of work. All right. So any more? Yep. I think it is important. Yeah. All right. So your research has been totally in English, correct? Me if I'm wrong, Jesse.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Great. Great. And so I think we do not have any more questions, and we are so you know, thrown away by this information. Those of you who are, you know, not so aware of register analysis, and, you know, we've been dealing with discourse analysis, so not register analysis on this side of the world, maybe, but this is an enlightening session. So, Jesse, I suppose we've come to the end of the session. I want to express our deepest gratitude as MCRN chair. Me and my team and the audience would like to express our gratitude to you for taking time to share this vast knowledge and insight with us. You are so kind in lending us your time and your expertise in this field. And it is so good to know that in this specialization of yours, that things are advancing, right? So it has been a privilege to learn about your research, and that you and Viber are, you know, really spearheading this still. He's going strong too. I'm very surprised. I read his book way, 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 way back, and he's going strong. So thank you again, Professor Egbert or Jesse. I hope this is it opens some ways or avenues for people to work with you over this side of the world, and that we'll be you know, on the lookout for your work. So thank you again for your generosity and sharing your time and expertise. We look forward to future collaboration, maybe possible external examiners for PhDs, maybe, and that and of course your work inspires new generation of researchers. All right, so thank you so much again. And let's give Jesse a round of applause or some applause emoji, applause emojis. And with that, I shall end the session. And I suppose, do we take a snapshot? If Raihana can just take a snapshot, that would be great, because I'm not so good with snapshots. It goes here and there. And if you all would like to switch on your camera, your video, or whatever you have there, so that we can take a snapshot with Jesse Egbert, the famous Jesse Egbert, finally. All right. Okay. Yeah, if you want to show your face, it's all right. If you don't, it's fine. Your name is there. Thank you. Rai, on your count.
Okay, all right. Maybe 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and smile, everyone. Okay, maybe another one, waiting for some people who's, you know, getting camera ready. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, smile.
Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Thank you very much, everyone. And to Jesse, all the best. It's lovely to have to know you, and very kind of you to correspond with me. It's such a short notice, and you know, all the back and forth emails. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Go get some sleep.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jesse. Thank you, Dr. Afida.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your attendance. Lovely. Bye-bye and good night. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Rai.
Thank you. Thank you, doctor.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
MCRNs. Bye. Bye, class. Bye, students. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.